All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s, when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. We continue with our series of episodes that look at stories from the past that may resonate with this year's midterm election. Maybe you're listening to this just the day before Election Day or on Election Day itself. But today we are going to New Jersey, to 1981, to a gubernatorial election in which Republicans were convinced that Democrats were going to cheat in the vote, and as a result established a number of tactics, especially on or around Election Day, to intimidate voters, mostly Black and Latino voters. We'll get into some of the details, which are really, really wild. People riding around wearing fake armbands, asking Black voters who they're going to vote for while they're standing in line. But look, we wanted to do this story, which has been on our list for a while. We wanted to do it now because it may resonate with how Election Day is playing out this year. There is, of course, already lots of distrust and accusations of cheating, and there are already stories of intimidation tactics and attempts to suppress the vote. And I'll just say it, most of this is being done, as it was in 1981, by the Republican Party. So there is a connection from 1981 to today. And of course, there's a connection from 1981 back through history when we think about the civil rights era and voter intimidation and then poll taxes and all sorts of stuff going into the 19th century. It's a good thing we have a historian of the 19th century and a historian of the 20th century here with us, as always, in the 21st century. Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
What's that thing? The present is a product of the past. Here we go. This story really bears out, I would say, the thesis of this show. But let's focus in on 1981. We have Tom Kean, a famous name in New Jersey. His son now is actually has been in politics for a long time and has an election coming up this year. But Tom Kean, Sr., is running for governor. Let's paint that 1981 context. This is a pretty critical election. It's kind of the first big election after Reagan has been elected, and it is in many ways seen as really vital to kind of the Reagan and new conservative project, right, Nikki?
Right. So these are these off-year elections. New Jersey has them. I think Virginia has them that come immediately after the presidential election. And so they're seen as a bellwether for how popular the new president is and how kind of sticky the results of the previous presidential year were, or whether there's a backlash brewing out there. So all eyes were on New Jersey for this race, and Republicans saw an opportunity to take the governor's mansion, but they will say professed concerns that there would be attempts to cheat. And that's when folks pulled together this sort of task force. They called themselves the National Ballot Security Task Force, and went out to Black and Latino neighborhoods to try to keep people from voting.
Before we talk about what those tactics actually were like, we should mention a familiar name roiled up in all of this, along with Tom Kean, who's a very, very familiar name. Campaign manager for Tom Kean's 1981 New Jersey gubernatorial campaign, a man by the name of Roger Stone. So
I'm over here shaking my head.
Fresh from the Nixon administration.
Did he have his Nixon back tattoo at that point in 1981? Yeah.
It seems fresher than 1981.
Yeah. But of course, Roger Stone, I would say, like, as we all know, has continued to be chief sort of conspiratorial whisperer into a lot of conservatives' ears. And he seemed to be doing that here, too, because as Nikki hinted at, this was born out of a conviction that Democrats were going to be the ones who were cheating. And often that's sort of how these things start out. You think the other side is up to something, and then you end up to something.
And these tactics, first of all, they spend a lot of money. They spent $75,000 investing in this patrol force. And, they made them look legit. So they have like walkie-talkies and they have, black armbands, and they're asking people questions like they're on official business, and they're asking people for their voter registration cards, and, all of these things that are not legal and clearly intimidation. Some of them are walking around with firearms, visible firearms. And so, you can imagine as an African American or as a Latino person, you're like, actually, I don't think I'm voting today. And they turned a lot of people away. People were visibly leaving the line because of these efforts.
And they were doing things like going to these Black and Latino neighborhoods. They were putting up signs that said they would be on the lookout for people casting fraudulent ballots. And then, as Kelly was saying, they would approach Latino and Black voters while they were standing in line and ask them, do you have your voter registration card? If you don't have your voter registration card, you can't vote. And so there is this real effort, not just to target Democrats, but to target people of color. And mixed in, they later learned with all of these folks, Kelly mentioned they were armed. There were off-duty police officers. There was this man named Anthony Imperiale who had been an elected official in the New Jersey state government who was among them, but who had also put together a white vigilante force in New Jersey in the late 1960s, where he was like, we're hunting the Black Panther. And so this idea that this was a very targeted and racially targeted operation is an important part to what happens next.
There's a dynamic here, too, between the kind of official arm of the party and the official arm of the gubernatorial candidate, and then kind of like vigilante justice. And that's a dynamic that continues today, and I want to talk about it in a minute. To point something out here, though, Kelly, you mentioned, that there was some funding going on here, and it's in the investigation after this. The Republican National Committee was the one that ponied up that $75,000. But, that's a key point here, is that this was actual, spending by the official arm of the party, of the GOP, that was going to these efforts.
It's also worth noting that in the early returns, it looked like the Republican was winning by like 2,000 votes out of 2.3 million cast. So it seemed to have been effective. And the head of the Republican National Committee was like, this is great. We're going to use this in other states. We would have been cheated out of that race if we hadn't done this.
Right. Yeah. And so Kane ends up winning by 1,800 votes. And it is really hard in a close election to sort of disentangle what leads to a win. And it is often, the margin of victory, if it's that small, it's often has a bunch of explanations. But certainly this was a force in that election, and certainly this was shady behavior, and possibly illegal behavior, to the extent that then, the government starts to investigate and poke around. And what it leads to is, and this is sort of one of the big fallouts from this, is what it leads to is a consent decree. And so now you have the government coming in and issuing a consent decree in November 1982, where the Republican committee signed a federal consent decree agreeing not to use race in selecting targets for ballot security activities and to refrain from deploying armed poll watchers. It also specifically barred the wearing of armbands at polling places. I don't know if we're going to see a consent decree going forward saying you're not allowed to flash a fake badge during a gubernatorial debate. But, there's something in here about kind of like what you can and can't do. And also this idea of that you can't. I mean, it's so funny that, I think it's just the legal nature of a consent decree, but that it parses down and says you can't use race for your voter intimidation. Yeah. It sort of implies like, we know you're up to all sorts of other things, but don't be this.
Don't be that guy. To me, I mean, all of this is so, like, this history is so old to me. Like, I'm like, all of these shenanigans were happening in the 19th century. The very same thing. Targeting Black voters, using violent force, often in some cases, showing up with guns and saying, you're going to vote today? You sure you want to vote today? Like having misleading information, telling people where they need to go, and that's actually like a dead end. There's nothing there. And using offshoots of political parties to create these vigilante groups that are not necessarily the GOP or the Democrats, but they're a part of those. They're like a subset or subversive subset of those organizations that are meant to like do the dirty work.
And this is part of the reason why in, say, like the late 19th century, the Populist Party is so intent on getting a secret ballot, because they believe that's a form of protection from election day violence, because prior to that, people could see who you were voting for, and that made it much easier to target some of that violence.
Yeah. It is worth pointing out, I said it in the intro, a lot of these tactics and a lot of the sort of like legal repercussions have been on the modern GOP. Kelly, you referred to the 19th century. There it was Southern Democrats who were up to this stuff. But, the party may change. The target of these tactics remains the same, right?
Yes.
It is Black people who want to vote.
Yes. And I mean, and you see it even in the early 20th century after Reconstruction ends. You get the polling tax, you get literacy tests, you get, in some cities, they would have people register to vote through the sheriff. So if you're a Black person, you're not going to the sheriff to register to vote. Or they have these all white primaries. I mean, sometimes they ask you questions that were just out and out ridiculous, like how many bubbles are in a bar of soap, or how many beans are in this jar, and then you would have to guess in order to vote. I mean, some of it at the soft side, it's ridiculous, but on the far inside, it's incredibly violent, and some people did lose their lives in trying to vote.
Yeah.
And in the mid-20th century, a lot of these same tactics were used. Members of the White Citizens Council would stand outside of the registrar's office or polling places and take pictures of Black people trying to register to vote or trying to vote. Those pictures would be sent to their employers and they would lose their jobs, or their names would be printed in the newspaper, which also made them targets of both economic and physical violence. So it was a well-worn, time-tested tactic.
Yeah. And there have been a lot of legal and legislative remedies to this, or attempts to remedy this, right? And so here we have a consent decree issued in 1982, and it, names a couple activities. But, it's important to look as much as at the gap in those laws as anything. And so, something like what you were saying, Kelly, like sending out a flyer that has misleading information about where you can vote or when election day is or whatever. I mean, that's not necessarily covered by this consent decree. There's also the Voting Rights Act. And we know, we haven't done an episode. I don't think we've done an episode on the overturning of Shelby versus Holder. But, the clawing back of the Voting Rights Act, which I think largely looked more at outcomes than specific tactics and tried to sort of address things that way. But, to me, and this is where it gets into this question of kind of what is being done as part of the official arm versus what is being done by people feeling like they're acting on behalf and of, their party. To me, this is really just more, all these things are symptoms of a larger disease, which is distrust, intimidation, fear, and, that's where it ties into today. And we're starting to see some of these tactics come back. But more than anything, what we're seeing is this larger culture of conspiracy and suspicion and fear, which then lets people act on that in all sorts of different ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, Roger Stone is the creator of Stop the Steal. Like the idea that you can put an idea out into the atmosphere, even before the election has even taken place, to allow people to no longer believe in the legitimacy of the electoral process is interesting too, because there's the backlash, and that is that there are some Republicans who are like, well, if it's already stolen, then I'm not going to vote, right? If it's already stolen, then there's no point in going to the polls. I mean, there are a lot of interesting ways in which the outcomes of these fear-mongering tactics have an impact in both directions.
I think it's also a reminder of how few and how narrow the protections for the right to vote more generally are. I mean, there are protections along racial lines that have been really degraded over the past decade or so. But it's also the same with something like gerrymandering. Like the Supreme Court has said, okay, well, you can't do gerrymandering if you specifically say that it's based on race, but you can gerrymander as much as you want otherwise. You can have partisan gerrymandering. Or in this case, you can't intimidate people based on race, but otherwise, I mean, yeah, you can intimidate them. And there just isn't a wholesale protection. There isn't a kind of sanctity about the right of people to vote. And we're seeing it attacked from all sides right now. And I think this suggests we need something much more robust than what we have.
Yeah, much more robust and then much further upstream than the specific laws about what can you use in your flyer, or like how close, there's all those laws about like how close can someone stand to the line. You have to be 100 feet away in some states or 150 feet away in some states, whether you're trying to intimidate or not. And all those are important and they do have an effect. I'm not trying to argue that you can't legislate and have an impact, but to me it's much more, this gets to this larger conversation we've had and people have had about the distinction between laws and norms, right? And this is another example of that. You can have all sorts of laws, but if the norm is we distrust, there's the other side is the enemy, the only way the other side could have possibly won is by cheating, that's the sort of norm violation, and that's the new norm that then leads to all these things further downstream. Let's talk a little bit about what we are seeing. Maybe 2020 first and then this election, because I know, Nikki, you wrote a little bit about 2020 and some of these tactics going into that election. And 2020 is interesting because, to bring it back to New Jersey, in 1982, they issued this consent decree that expires in 2017. There's a bunch of sort of updates to it and it gets relitigated, but it basically fully expires in 2017. And 2020 was looked at as the sort of first election post this consent decree, the first election where Republicans had, sort of stopped getting their knuckles wrapped about this stuff. And so there was a lot of fear about this going into that election. Can you sort of characterize that going into 2020 and what we ended up seeing as that election played out?
This was important because I think we've focused so much on the violence after the election that we tend to forget that this was in the air during the general election, that Donald Trump in one of the debates had told the Proud Boys, which is a vigilante group, to stand back and stand by. In one of the debates, I think he was asked, not to endorse violence, and instead he called for poll watchers to come out and protect the polls. And you saw a little bit of that. One of the reasons why you don't necessarily see as much as you might have expected is because voting in 2020 was all over the place because of the pandemic. But in some ways along these lines, you see the post office trying to make it more difficult for people to drop off mail-in ballots. So there was a lot of targeting of these new polling sites in 2020, which has now sort of continued into 2022.
Yeah, you see it. I saw it just on the news not too long ago in Arizona, where there are like armed men that are standing outside of the drop-off boxes, making sure that people aren't stuffing ballots and all that stuff. And I don't know. I think about how intimidating it would be if I, had a long day of work and drove and it's night and I'm going to drop off my ballot or something, and someone's standing there with the gun. Like that's incredibly terrifying. And it would make me think twice about casting a ballot. And so these are real circumstances that have to be addressed.
And I think you can fold into those videos from Florida that show people who had cast a ballot erroneously being arrested, and that those images and videos came out just before the 2022 election was assigned to people who had felony convictions, even if they had the right to vote, that they're not going to want to lest they find themselves in prison.
Yeah. In Arizona, these are sort of vigilantes, individual citizens who are going, and there's a sort of phenomenon of tailgating around ballot boxes that's going on, tailgating with guns around ballot boxes. In Florida, that was the DeSantis administration setting up, an official quote unquote task force to then do this sort of thing. So again, we see it happening up and down in this mix of sort of official arms of campaigns and this more vigilante justice. Yeah, the ballot box thing is interesting in the kind of way that 2020 is a hard one to measure for so many reasons because it was such a strange election. And, but it did change the way that we vote in many ways in this country. And I think a big fight is going to be, are those changes permanent? Because there is a distrust on the right of ballot boxes and the idea that like elections happen over a course of time and maybe we can't then just focus in on election day and potentially deploy some of these tactics. So it will be interesting. I don't think it's a coincidence that the drop-off boxes were the places that were targeted for some of these tactics in Arizona, because that is the new front line of, where elections happen.
Yeah.
And the subject of Dinesh D'Souza's, so-called documentary, 2000 Mules.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. As we wrap up, I do have a bigger question or thought for the two of you, which is, I think, to my mind, it is clear that there is this air of distrust and that it is manifesting itself in all sorts of different ways. Official tactics like we've been discussing and vigilante justice like we've been discussing. That said, and this is one of the paradoxes of this moment, turnout has been higher in these last few elections than basically in any point in U.S. history, right? And as crazy and suppressed and everything it feels, there is massive turnout and there's massive political engagement. And so I don't know what we make of that. You know, how do we square those two, right? Because if we're trying to paint a picture of voter suppression, how is it that our elections are turning out tons and tons and tons of people?
Well, something similar to this happened in the late 19th century as well, as more restrictions were being put on Black voting. All of the attention and discussion about how sacred and sanctified the right to vote was and how some people should have it and some people shouldn't actually brought more people out to the polls because there was such an emphasis in the public conversation about why voting is important and why it should be protected, even if by protecting it, you were excluding certain people from being able to do it. So that's part of it. And when you put people's rights under threat, that can also be a big driver of people turning out. Yeah.
I always think that for better or for worse, fear is a motivator. And so I think it gets people out to the ballot box for one reason or another. And I think that people on both sides are terrified about the direction of this country, and to some extent rightly so. And so the vote is one way that you can sort of voice, or perhaps the strongest way that you can voice what direction you want the country to go in. And people are doing that.
Yeah. And I would also just add that even though there are record-breaking numbers of Americans turning out to vote, that doesn't make it okay that people who have the right to vote have been prevented from doing so. Like those are missing voters. And, you know, regardless of whether the sum total has been driven down, there are people who are being deprived of their basic rights of citizenship.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And within those massive turnout numbers, the margins are still so small. Everything is on such a knife's edge that, you know, a little intimidation here and there goes a long way. And, you know, I mean, I think that's kind of...
Not even just intimidation, but even one piece of, even having an ID can drop the number of people that are going to vote. So on top of the intimidation, the laws that are put in place to sort of curve who gets the ballot box as quickly as possible and who doesn't is a huge deterrent.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that. We're not going to get into the whole ID for voting thing. It's a whole thing. But I will say, like, you know, I was thinking about this as getting ready for this episode, that like there are legit, you know, even for me, someone who comes from, you know, I think my basic stance is like voting is good and the easier it is to vote, the better. I still think there are legit conversations to be had about how we vote, you know, in what are the mechanisms? Sure, let's think about, you know, voter fraud, as little evidence as there is for it. Like, let's think about that, you know, but to me, it's like those conversations should happen in a larger context of trust in the system, not distrust, right? And what's happening now is let's sow as much distrust as possible and then try to have a conversation, which just doesn't feel like progress at all, you know? And so I'm like, there's all these things that, we should talk about them, but they can only be productive if they come from a baseline of trust in the system and trying to build more and more trust, not undermine it. But I think that's not everyone's coming from where I am, which is like trying to actually improve this. I think there's a lot of people who actively are trying to not improve this.
That's right.
So, did I tell you guys about how I went to go vote? I can't remember if this was in Massachusetts or when I lived in New York, probably Massachusetts. Anyways, I go to vote and there's this older Black lady who's a pollster, and I pulled out my ID, my driver's license, and she like snarled at me. She was like, "Put that away." I was like, oh, yes, ma'am. Like, but her thing was like, "Don't you pull out a driver's license? Don't you pull out an ID? Just sign right here and sign right here. Like, what's your address?" Like, and then she got really sweet. But I was just like, you know, for her, it was so important that like, no, you don't need this in order to vote. Now, where do you live? Like, I was like, okay, thanks.
Interesting. Yeah. All right. Well, listeners, you know, maybe you are standing in line as you are listening to this, or maybe you are driving over to drop your ballot into a drop box, or maybe you're like have voted early, you know, like a lot of people did, and you're like polishing your "I voted" sticker. But anyway, hopefully this gives you something to think about going into election day, and we will see. You know, we will see. I think this election is going to be really interesting. Obviously consequential politically, but I think also a really interesting test if you think of it as it is a midterm. It is also, sort of, quote unquote, the first post-pandemic election. Like, I think all of the things that felt like they were lining up in 2020, which just got skewed for a million reasons. Maybe this year we'll get a clearer picture of kind of what is the state of voting in this country a little bit. But I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, thanks to all of you for listening. Thank you for voting. And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.